Okay, hello and welcome everyone to our webinar, Exposing Violence Against Women in the United States, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. This webinar is the second of a three-part series that will explore the critical issue of gender-based violence in the United States, based on findings and recommendations from the Behind Closed Doors report. My name is Amani. I am a research fellow with the Population Institute. We are co-hosting this webinar today with Indigenous Justice Circle. I am also one of the co-authors of the Behind Closed Door report that we're going to be talking about today. Just as a reminder before we get started, we are going to have a Q&A with all of our speakers at the end. So if you have questions throughout, feel free to place them in the Q&A function. We're also going to be sharing relevant links to the reports and the websites of all the organizations that we're going to be hearing from today. So you can go to the next slide. So our report, Behind Closed Doors, is about exposing and addressing harmful gender-based practices in the United States. Today's webinar will focus on femicide, which is the deliberate killing of women and girls because of their gender. And we want to take today to have a specific call to attention for Indigenous women and girls. This webinar will include a broad level analysis of systemic factors contributing to femicide, its impact on communities, and the urgent need for prevention and justice. So you can go to the next slide. Oh, you can go to the, thank you. So a little bit about this report is we really wanted to focus on gender-based violence as it occurs in the United States. And there's a lot of resistance to recognizing harmful gender-based practices in the US, which is due in no small part to the idea of American exceptionalism. It's this idea that America is morally superior and more technologically advanced than the rest of the world. So problems like gender-based violence and things like femicide theoretically don't happen here, but throughout this report, we were able to delve into the reasons why American culture in particular has pervasive gender-based violence. We really wanted to recognize the harm and foster global awareness of these issues, build alliances across communities, cultures, and borders, and really try to cultivate a sense of cultural humility and recognizing that things like gender-based violence occur in all places, regardless of cultural background or borders. And so our goal with this report is to find solutions and interventions to dismantle these oppressive structures and advocate for positive change. So now I'm going to hand things over to the co-author of Behind Closed Doors, Maniza, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the parts of the report that relate to today's webinar.
Thank you, Mani, for that introduction of Behind Closed Doors and the webinar. As Mani said, I'm Maniza. I'm a research associate at Population Institute and also the co-author of Behind Closed Doors. So just to get right into it, what exactly is femicide? And I ask that because this isn't typically a phrase we use in American contexts, but we've used it intentionally in Behind Closed Doors because it's important to connect what's happening here in the States to patterns across the world related to gender-based violence. So the way we define this is an intentional killing of a woman or girl because of their gender. And some related terms that might be more familiar to US audiences include gender-related killing or gender-based murder. And this is essentially the most extreme form of gender-based violence and can occur in any context, but more often than not, women are targeted by someone that they already know. And it's usually the final culmination of ongoing abuse, threats of, or intimidation or sexual violence. And it's also really important to note that the prevalence and existence of femicide is deeply entrenched in harmful societal norms that include toxic masculinity, which is defined as the roles, behaviors, and attributes associated with maleness that reaffirm the patriarchy and emphasize the superiority of masculinity over femininity. So essentially, when men see women as secondary or even as property, they are encouraged to use violence as a means to assert this dominance and control. So the harms of femicide go beyond just the loss of life, which of course is the extreme form of gender-based violence that we're referring to. But femicide victims usually face multiple acts of violence, degradation, psychological and physical isolation, and just debilitating fear before femicide occurs. And this harm is really felt by everyone around them, the entire community. Friends and family can experience a combination of loss, grief, poor health, compromised functioning at school or work, and surviving children often face the worst of these effects. And in general, femicide also contributes to a harmful culture of fear and silence, and contributes to this culture where women and girls are restricted in their economic, political, and social opportunities by this harmful culture. So just to keep toxic masculinity, the patriarchy going, femicide is used as a tool for that, and women are not allowed to advance. So while we don't typically associate femicide with the states, it very much is prevalent here and on the rise. So the United States accounts for one of the highest femicide rates among all high-income countries, accounting for about 70% of all femicide cases that occur among high-income countries. And the last reported count was 2.2 deaths per 100,000 women in 2021. And like I said, it's been on the rise. So the Violence Policy Center reported that the incidence rate of femicide has increased by 24% from 2014 to 2020. And most of these deaths were by firearm. In 2020, for example, more than 2,000 women were murdered by men, and a majority of these cases were by gun. And it's also really important to note that these deaths are extremely disproportionate. Men are murdering Black women and girls at a rate almost 3 times higher than white women, and Native American and Alaska Native women experience the second highest rate, which our speakers today will dive more into. And it is true that every femicide case has a unique context and is in need of specialized attention, but the fact of the matter is that gender-based violence is universal, unfortunately. And also always important to mention is the disproportionate impact on the LGBTQ plus community. There is an extreme lack of reporting in this area, but it is clear that specifically Black transgender women experience higher rates of victimization and homicide than their cisgender counterparts. So this graph is just kind of outlining what I mentioned before from the rise of the incidence of men killing women from 2014 till now. We do see, like, from before there was a steady drop, and we'll talk more about why that might be. So in the United States, femicide has always been used as a tool of control, whether that's control of a husband over a wife, or even as a tool of manifest destiny and white supremacy and colonization. It has kept the way our society is going. We've always had policies that restricted women's mobility in society, which has contributed to this harmful imbalanced power dynamic that upholds domestic violence and femicide. So thinking back to that graph, we have advocacy beginning around, like, there's some advocacy in the 1800s, and then in the beginning in the 60s is really when feminist advocates began organizing shelters and hotlines for domestic violence survivors. Marital rape was finally recognized as a crime in the 1970s, so we have some introduction of the rights of a wife. There were certain reforms to uplift women's economic and political power that started cropping up, and then more attention just finally started to be given towards the structural roots of violence rather than just this one man is bad and this one man is bad, but like, what is the pattern across all of them? So then if we flash forward to 1994, that's when Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act. And after this, rates of domestic violence seemingly decreased. The legislative package was designed to improve criminal justice responses to sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking by increasing access and availability to support services. So this was also reauthorized in 2000, 2005, 2013, and 2022. It's mainly been effective in expanding federal criminal response to gender-based violence, but it's also created some grant programs. A major win was increasing tribal power in addressing violence and establishing protections for vulnerable populations. But there are some criticisms of the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, one being that the policy has a disproportionate focus on criminalization and not other effective strategies that may be more survivor focused. It doesn't always address the disproportionate impact felt by different types of people, different communities. And there's also been major issues in addressing gun control with VAWA, which before the gun control measures was more bipartisan. But in 2022, VAWA did include the National Instant Criminal Background Check System Denial Notification Act, which requires the U.S. Attorney General to issue a report to relevant law enforcement within 24 hours when someone attempts to purchase a firearm but is denied due to their background check. And in 2022, President Biden also signed the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which narrowed what we call the boyfriend loophole that allowed domestic violence abusers who aren't married to their victims to still access guns. So there is, of course, still loads of work to be done in this area. There is a dire need for early prevention strategies and awareness building, improved surveillance and research, and preventative laws. So, for example, in awareness building, promoting early education to challenge harmful gender norms from an early age is imperative. Gender transformative work that promotes conversation between all types of genders can shift power structures over time. This work can mean incorporating discussions in school on power dynamics and bodily autonomy, or even discussions in community spaces with leaders like religious leaders. And a major way this can be done is also through comprehensive sexuality education, which is a great tool to standardize curriculum across the country surrounding sex education, gender dynamics, and bodily autonomy. Focusing on survivor-led initiatives and survivor-focused initiatives is a best way for better understanding gender-based violence and how their needs can be met before it gets to the point of femicide. This can also help to improve community response to gender-based violence and help folks be better aware of recognizing a violent situation at someone's home to support a survivor. In terms of preventative legislation in the United States, like I said before, women and girls would greatly benefit from stronger gun laws. Here, a woman is 28 times more likely to die by firearm homicide than women in any other high-income nations. So right now, advocates are focusing on enforcement of existing laws and limiting further gun access because there are so many guns in circulation and there isn't really one clear legislative pathway to reduce this. So focusing on enforcement of laws that already exist in terms of firearm relinquishment laws and further restricting access to domestic violence abusers through like stronger background check laws, closing all loopholes that exist, different things like that. And finally, we do just need better investment in data collection. We have a lot of mortality data related to femicide, but we don't really have the analysis we need to further understand the relationships between the assailants and victims, which can really inform risk and protective factors and in turn effective intervention strategies. So I mentioned this before, but whenever talking about gender-based violence and especially femicide, it is extremely important we take note of the very unique harms on the LGBTQ plus community. Data is very, very lacking in this space, but it was recorded in 2022 that almost 500 gender identity motivated hate crimes were recorded, and this is probably less than what happened. And even with very limited data from 2014, estimates showed that a transgender woman has the risk of becoming a murder victim at 4.3 times the rate of the general population of women. And I want to recognize that we are in uncertain times, unprecedented times right now, but femicide has been on the rise since 2014, and there hasn't been much evidence for a long time of a focus towards decreasing it. I mean, we don't even really want to admit that it's happening here. Like I said before, LGBTQ plus community is extremely targeted over the years. In 2023, at least 510 anti-LGBTQ plus bills were introduced. And these bills contribute to this extremely hostile environment against the community. And harmful rhetoric that we're hearing right now surrounding the trans community specifically, and even just cutting the word gender out from all programming, is contributing to harmful power dynamics between all the genders. We've also seen a lot of harmful funding cuts, for example, slashing the funding for the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women, which has been pretty instrumental in supporting things like domestic violence shelters. But I'll stop there. That was just a general overview of what femicide looks like in the United States and what the issue is. But I'll turn it over to our amazing panelists for today, which will be shifting the conversation a bit to another very under-recognized problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women within the US.
Thank you so much, Maniza, and I am honored to introduce our very first speaker today, Dr. Kelly Hallman, who is an enrolled Cherokee Nation citizen. She has designed, evaluated, and strengthened scores of gender equity and violence prevention initiatives across Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Indian country. She's the founder and executive director of Indigenous Justice Circle, a Native American female-led nonprofit focusing on health, culture, and economic programs, data, and grant making. And they are also the co-sponsor of today's webinar. Dr. Hallman is the social change agent in the documentary film The Lakota Daughters, and the author of numerous articles, including Our Body, Our Data, Our Destinies, Native American Women Harnessing Technology for the Benefit of Our People. Kelly also advised the Association for Economic Research of Indigenous People. She received her PhD and MA in economics from Michigan State University and her BA from Northern Arizona University.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Amani, and thank you, Maniza, for the amazing statistics. We are certainly not exceptional, and we face this problem with all the women of the world. So next slide, please, Amani. Next slide. Thank you. American Indian and Alaska Native women face disproportionately high rates of violence and homicide compared to other racial and ethnic groups in the U.S. You'll hear more about this from both Amanda and Gwen today. Next slide, please. I wanted to give a little bit of lived experience about this crisis. This is a multifaceted problem and fueled by structural racism and sexism combined with intergenerational trauma among Native people that stems from loss of ancestral lands, connection to culture, and these fuel feelings of isolation and depression among our entire population. My community is a case in point. Many women were blocked from opportunities because of settler colonial forms of patriarchy, control, and violence practiced by both Native and non-Native men in our communities and spaces. Some of our men carry the pain of government policies that rob them of their traditional roles of economic provisioning and protection of families. Some transferred this hurt to their spouses, sisters, and children. The need to control something more than history afforded them has at times resulted in acting out of abuse, including gun violence. Other Native women I know have been stalked and threatened by men from outside of our community. In both domestic violence and stalking instances that I'm personally aware of, protection and restraining orders are difficult to come by, and when they are obtained, they're not upheld due to limited and fractured law enforcement and other factors. These barriers to legal protections combined with uneven employment and housing instability can result in disconnection and fear among our women and girls. Basically, isolation and control are the tools of gender-based violence, and our women are very much subject to these. Next slide, please. So a recent report by the National Congress of American Indians talked about some of the factors that lead to murdered and missing Indigenous persons, in particular women. and girls. And the key findings from their report include the number of unresolved cases among Indigenous people. They counted 4,200 of these. Also, there's a disproportionate burden among women and girls, as we've already stated. 84% of American Indian women have experienced violence in their lifetime. And on some reservations, the murder rate is 10 times what the national average is for women. As I already mentioned, there are law enforcement challenges, severe lack of resources, lack of cultural competence among many law enforcement individuals, along with a lack of standardized protocols, mean responses are delayed and cases remain unresolved for a long time. There's also disproportionate media coverage. The data show that if a non-native, particularly a white person goes missing, then there's a lot more coverage of it and awareness of this than there is among both Native and Black individuals. Next slide, please. So there are some historical factors that have led to this crisis among Indigenous women and girls in particular, and I'll go through a few of those today just so you can get a sense of how things were for our women before colonial contact and how things have evolved so that they are more at risk today. Next slide, please. So this graph shows the conditions of Haudenosaunee or Iroquois women around the time that America became a country or shortly thereafter. And it's contrasted with the conditions of European/American women, white women at the time. And you can see that along most realms of life, Native women had a lot more rights and responsibilities, respect than did white women. So you can see in the spiritual realm that Native women led ceremonies, whereas white women were forbidden to speak, usually in church. In the social realm, GBV was not tolerated by our men, or they were sanctioned and corrected. Women also had a lot of freedom to move about the public space, whereas that was not the case for white women. In terms of economic leadership, Native women communally managed agriculture and other resources, and they owned physical property, whereas white women in particular were owned by their husbands. They weren't able to own their own property, so things were very different. Politically, also, Native women had large leadership roles. They were clan mothers and really called the shots in terms of resolving disputes. And that was not the case for for white/European women at the time. Next slide, please. One of the mechanisms by which things changed for Native American women and girls were different pieces of legislation, including land that was taken from us, land being divided into individual plots instead of communally managed. But another big factor were boarding schools where Native children were forced to be assimilated into white culture and to give up Native values and traditions. And so this is a quote from a missionary in Wisconsin in the 1800s. And this person recognized the role that women and girls played in their communities. And it says, Native girls need the Christian cultural training more than boys, as they will wield a greater influence in the future. If we get the girls, we get the race. And so girls in particular have been a real sort of target for forced change and forced you need to act the way we want you to. Next slide, please. So of the many policies by which Native people have been forced to assimilate, including the two I just mentioned, as well as urban relocation, our tribal governments being taken away, et cetera, these have major consequences for our modern lives. And if you could go to the next slide, please. One example of that is the lack of access to our own families. You can see here the proportion of children who have an incarcerated parent, and it's 18% for Native children, which is in the dark blue bar there. Children who live with only one parent. It's high among African American children, but it's also very high. Half of Native children have access to only one of their parents, either because of that parent has left to try to find a job, or they're incarcerated, or for other structural inequality reasons. Next slide, please. Also, within our Native community, men have access to more financial education, financial means, credit, loans, things like that. You can see here that husbands and brothers of Native women are less likely to be financially fragile. They have more emergency savings. They have more non-retirement investments. They're also more likely to be financially literate than our Native women. Next slide, please. Okay, the slide isn't changing for me. Oh, there we go. Suicide rates are also very high among Native American people. You can see the AIAN set of bars that I have circled on the bottom of the graph. And these are very high for both females and males, but you can see the time difference between the blue and the green bars between 99 and 2017. The rate of suicide is increasing substantially for Native women. It's going up for Native men, but it's twice, the increase is twice for Native women than it is for Native men. So you can see this is a real problem that is getting worse. Next slide, please. These are some data from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that is fielded by the CDC. And these graphs here show, first of all, American Indian girls versus white girls. And American Indians are in the orange bars. You can see that they're much more likely to have been physically attacked, to have seen someone physically attacked than white girls. Next slide, please. And this is Native girls versus Native boys. You can see that Native girls are more likely to have experienced someone being physically attacked than their Native male counterparts. And they're also more likely to have been bullied at school than Native boys. Next slide, please. And this shows the racial differences within girls. American Indian girls are much more likely to have been physically forced to have sexual intercourse than white girls. They're more likely to have experienced sexual violence by anyone, and they're just about equally as likely to be sexually active as white girls. Next slide, please. And in this slide, it's within the Native community, boys versus girls. Girls are more likely to have experienced forced sex, to have been sexually violated by someone, and to be more sexually active than our boys of the same age. Next slide, please. So what can be done? Let's turn to the next slide to get some answers. So according to the National Congress of American Indians report that I alluded to earlier, there are some recommendations at the macro level that we wholeheartedly agree with, and that includes increasing funding to law enforcement agencies to improve response times and investigative capabilities, enhance their cultural training so that they understand how Native communities work, what the sensitivities are, what Native values are, how to communicate better with Native people. Also, public awareness campaigns. A lot of people are not aware of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQ crisis. And certainly this is something that deserves a lot more immediate media attention. And as Maniza said earlier, we need better data collection. We need not only more data collection, we need better recording of people's race and ethnicity within existing data collection, and we need more resources to analyze existing data that are out there. And that includes research by Native people and Native organizations about their own communities. Next slide, please. So we also want to emphasize female-focused preventive and early warning approaches. That includes safety and connectedness in one's own community and between rural and urban communities that people often commute to find work, to go to school, etc. We want to emphasize Indigenous health and well-being, including spirituality and our own Native practices that keep us safe and together. And we also want to, again, raise awareness in our own communities about violence and the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis and ways to prevent it, including early warning systems, ways that women and girls can be, convened on a regular basis. And if someone doesn't show up, we know that there might be something going on with them. So I will leave it there for the moment. Just one more slide, I think, and then we'll turn it over. Yeah, so this is what one form of that looks like. So we want to build a bridge over this chasm of things that can happen to us as Native women and girls, including abuse, violence, school dropout, trafficking, sexual assault, etc. Suicide. So we want to provide some of the things that are in this safe red road for us. We often are torn between walking between the white world, the white road, and the red road, and we want to be able to do both safely. And on this red road that we all want to have access to, we want to have supportive connections, socio-emotional skills and support, cultural knowledge, education, health, and training access, as well as financial skills early in life, but throughout life. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hallman. I look forward to hearing some more from you during our Q&A. Our next speaker is Amanda Takes Warbonnet. Amanda is an Oglala Lakota tribal citizen and the public education specialist / advocate trainer for Native Women's Society of the Great Plains, Reclaiming Our Sacredness, a coalition of domestic violence and sexual assault programs committed to reclaiming the sacredness of women. She is a graduate of Sinta Gleska University with a master's in mental health and Oglala Lakota College in human services and Lakota studies. She spends time in the field of Lakota history and genealogy, working with families to build family trees and stories, and is an elder advisor to the Oglala Lakota colleges. They bring their stories back, connecting the Lakota Wild West performers to Pine Ridge community. She is part of the White Dragonfly Society, a traditional Lakota women's society supporting families with ceremonies and cultural teachings. She has 4 children, 3 stepchildren, 13 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandsons.
Thank you. One of the reasons that I've been with Native Women's Society of the Great Plains is just that, reclaiming our sacredness. And that's a really powerful philosophy that I see that really helps when we talk about violence against Native women, when we talk about the MMIP crisis, that, we really need to reach into and find that connection that we have, that our ancestral grandmas had. And it's all woven in what Kelly was talking about as part of that vision change. Next slide. So, I don't want to go too much into the history of it but that's the really important part of why we're in this situation now, because of what happened in history and how that change has come through the last 50 years of trying to protect Native women, to get policies, go into the halls of Congress, to change policies clear down to the grassroots and with our tribal leadership and in our tribal communities. And, the state of the data on violence against American Indian and Alaska Native women's, we hear it constantly. Women and girls experience higher rates of that violence. And there's studies that have been done of it. We have also had a study done. It wasn't a formal study, but we did a lot of awareness in large gatherings where there were Native Americans, like powwows and conferences, and we had a short survey on sexual assault, just to see how people had thought of sexual assault in their community, what knowledge they knew about it in their community. And so we must have did several thousand of them, and it showed that just what they were talking about on that national level, that we had more like 2 in 3 Native women or Native persons that were sexually violated in their lifetime. And what I saw in that survey was that the silence of it. Like when we hear the term silence is violence, that's how it was. So many of them were sexually violated. They were traumatized when they were young, but they didn't do anything about it. It was more of an acceptance. And so with that, we look at that normalization that we really did through history of what the violence against Native women, of what's going on in our tribal communities, how accepting and normalized that we have made it, especially in our tribal communities. And women and girls experience violence more commonly by the non-American Indian perpetrators. Then we look at what we've been saying is that the victims of violence are less likely to receive needed services. And so we really do, in our grassroots level, we do lack so much resources that we need, because we need that healing, we need that education, we need to have our tribal leadership make more policies, do more work in this area, but we normalize it so much. So we don't have that data that we should have. And how do you take that data and use it to your benefit? Next slide. So the data trends, and we've some of the slides before, went through this and how it is. It's really impacting that, their high rates, the homicide, the sexual violence. And then, and since 2017, we have really did focus on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And that came forth from people moving forward into those halls of Congress and saying, hey, look, this is a really big issue that we have, and it intersects with what we're having with the violence against Native women, the sexual violence against Native women. So we really need to take a look at this. And this has been happening not just since, we had May 5th as Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Awareness Day. This has been happening in history for a long time, and we just have normalized this so much that we haven't really looked at it like we should have. And so with that, with those 3 congressmen coming forth and making that May 5th a day of an awareness, it created a really awareness that we needed to do. Sometimes I think it doesn't go the way that it should go, but it creates that awareness, and I've heard that so many times is, why is this happening now? Why, when it has been happening? And I realized that when in 2017, when I went to DC to make a statement so we could get that May 5th Day of Awareness, I was trying to think of how I could make an impact statement, and I realized that that was in my family. It was in my family history that I had an aunt that went missing. I had all this violence that happened in my family, but yet it's just an example of how we normalized it. So when we look at this data like this, it's more of we're trying to say, these rates are high. We have all these bad statistics. We have all this going on, but how can we use it within our grassroots community level to make a change, to make a difference? So, there was one thing that, a phrase that in 2017 that, Native women, they disappear twice. They disappear once in real life and they disappear again in the media. And so that just brings that topic to the awareness that we really need to be doing. Next slide. So when we look at that, then a lot of times we need to look at what happened in history. What was the grassroots? How did we come to this part? What happened with us Native women? So to look in history at what brought this forward? Why did we normalize this so much? To really take that awareness and look at the grassroots of causes of this, the colonization, the broken treaties, the genocide that happened, um, and how that affected the law and policies that govern us now, and then the resources and the unequal effects that we have, with that, and the risk factors. So I think this is a really cool image because it just explains it in a way, how it, social detriments of health and it affected our employment, our education, our culture, community, and the domestic violence risk factors. But when you look at them both, it's the historical behavior, social, political impact, and how. So really taking a look at that history part, as some people term it, the intergenerational and historical trauma is what we really need to look at to find that root cause, and we can move forward with it. Next slide. So, to do that social change, we need that vision, especially in our tribal communities. That's where really, really a lot of the work needs to be done. We can have these laws that change on the national level, but we really need to have laws that are changing and policies that are changing in our tribal community levels to get that education out there. And using that vision from our ancestors and imagine a world with respect and harmony, and how can we make that change in our own tribal communities. And it's really hard. Education is a really valuable part of it. On May 5th, there was a event that was held in Rapid City, and Gabby Tito's father was there on the foundation that they formed after the incidents, and the national media was on her case. And one of the things that he said that I thought was really profound was he said that, if education was a part of it, it's really important to do that awareness. And maybe the outcomes would have been different if there was that education piece there. And so that's really a valuable part of this. So what Kelly's talking about in working with girls, that's really valuable part, that we need to do those teachings and to strengthen and do a lot of education in our tribal communities. Next slide. So, we can learn from our ancestors and we can come up with those solutions. How can we make those changes in our tribal grassroots community? And like Sitting Bull said, take what is good from the white man and leave what is bad. Next slide. And this is just touching on tribal sovereignty. What is it? When we're looking as Native women, then we have several layers. We have tribal sovereignty, and we have jurisdictional issues too. We face those, and it really an education part to look at that when we're looking at ourselves as Native women. Because we face different jurisdictional issues as our non-Native women friends. And when we're looking at, we have, what is our sovereignty? Not only our tribal sovereignty, but what is the sovereignty that we have with our body, and how we had that and how our ancestral grandmas had it, and where did we lose some of that at? And so to really do the education and awareness to our youth to be able to get that back. This is the sovereignty of your body and the control use and of the whole power and control thing. Where do you stand in that? Using our language and our cultural identity to really be able to impact it. Next slide. So that's the big word, is women's sovereignty. And I think that's really important when we do the education in our tribal communities, is that we need to have girls and women understand that they have sovereignty. They have a right to control their bodies and their self-governance, and look at the resources they have, and their identity into history and culture. What is that they need to move forward? Next slide. So it's just making the whole power and control. And so many times, when we do this work in our shelters in our tribal community with advocates, and we're doing this work to really understand what is that power and control about. Where the voices of the women who have been battered, raped, with those of the Winkte community, Native people, other disenfranchised groups. And I just want to put in here too that, with the new administration, it is, we are facing funding cuts, and we're facing changes, because those mandates, they're going to trickle down into what we're doing with the money that we get from the federal government. So we really need to take a cultural view at that and do things differently from what they're demanding us to do. Next slide. So just looking at the framework, what we could build, and a lot of that has to do with our community awareness, education, and to really address what's going on there, even the trauma-informed issues, the mental health part of it, and the healing that is so, so important is how we can create healing. How can we push the knowledge of healing that people need to heal from this? That when you have a mother of children and she went through a trauma, or when they lost somebody in their family, you know, that really affects those consequences. They cause ripples into the infrastructure of our families and our tribal communities, and into our whole reservation when we have those. It's not just the family, it's a ripple effect. So when we look at that, is, you know, it's really is a complex policy and jurisdictional gaps that we look at, that we need to promote that education on. And the laws, tribal protocols on healthy relationships. You know, we don't emphasize enough about healthy relationships in comparison to the violence, the teen dating violence, femicide, intimate partner violence, the domestic violence, the sexual violence, and to really look forward in our our cultural healing part, and to provide more grassroots advocacy. And funding is a big issue, you know, but when you look at some of our ancestral communities, they had a balance there, and they didn't require funding from the federal government. They had that balance that was already built in. So to be able to look at that and see with those cultural views and see how we can use that in our communities. I think that's my last slide. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. I will now be introducing our final speaker for today. Gwendolyn Packard is Ihantuan, Dakota, is the Director for STARS Indigenous Safe Housing Center, a project of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, has worked for many years in Indian country, both at the national and tribal level, and has served as editor for 6 national Indian publications. In 1990, she was instrumental in founding the National Organization on Fetal Alcohol Syndrome. She served as executive director for Morning Star House, an advocacy program that works with off-reservation Indian women and children who are victims of domestic and sexual violence. She also served as the executive director of the New Mexico Suicide Prevention Coalition and is founder and co-chair of Rain Cloud, the off-reservation behavioral health collaborative in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She is a survivor of domestic violence, a writer, a grassroots organizer, and a community activist. She has made a commitment to social change in working to address social and economic justice issues that affect the health and well-being of Indian people.
Well, I just did all that muted. I'm so sorry. Thank you for that introduction, Amani. Hello, everyone. I'm Gwendolyn Packard, Ihangtawan, Dakota, and a survivor of domestic violence, coming to you from Omaha, Nebraska. I'm an older Indigenous woman with shoulder-length silver hair, reading glasses, and a blue star-themed background. I'm currently the director for STARS, the Indigenous Safe Housing Center, dedicated to addressing the critical intersection of housing instability, homelessness, and domestic violence among American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiians, and in tribal communities both on and off reservation. STARS stands for something. It stands for safety, training, technical assistance, resources, and support. STARS strengthens advocacy and support for Native survivors by identifying and challenging systemic barriers and expanding access to safe, stable, and culturally appropriate housing. STARS is built on a human rights framework and lifts the voices of survivors and those with lived experience while centering Indigenous lifeways throughout the housing spectrum. STARS looks at housing through both a gender-based violence and an Indigenous lens. The need for safe and affordable housing is one of the most pressing concerns for American Indian, Alaska Native survivors of domestic violence, and it is directly linked to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis. 50% of our homeless population identified domestic violence as a primary cause. And a significant number, anywhere from 22 to 57% of homeless women report that domestic violence was the immediate cause of their homelessness. Survivors often remain in abusive relationships and living environments because they have nowhere else to go. They don't want to be unhoused and living in the streets with their children or at unsafe shelters, homeless shelters. The rates of violence against Indigenous women are more than twice the national average, and in some cases 10 times the rate of non-Native survivors. 92% of homeless women have experienced severe physical or sexual abuse at some point in their lives, oftentimes on the streets or in homeless shelters. 63% of unhoused women have been victims of domestic violence. 38% of domestic violence will become homeless at some point. And we know that sexual assault is both a precursor to and a consequence of homelessness. And of course, we can't ignore the documented connections between child welfare, child removal, and housing. Next slide, please. May 5th is the National Day of Awareness for our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. On this day, we work to raise awareness and honor the memory of Indigenous women who were stolen, and honor those who are still missing and those whose remains have been found, and for the families and communities who mourn the loss and the death of their members. It's a time to recognize the loss and grief we've experienced as a people, and a time to strengthen our resilience and call for justice, for victims and survivors, and for families and for communities. The story of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is much older than Hannah Harris, whose birth date and tragic death resulted in the Montana congressional delegation to push the U.S. Senate to pass a resolution declaring May 5th as a National Day of Awareness. Indigenous women and girls have been missing and murdered since 1492. Our women and girls have been raped, assaulted, kidnapped, stolen, trafficked, and murdered since contact. And it's also important to note or to remember that the number one casualty of any of our battles and Indian wars was women and children. It's also important to know that this war on Indian women and children has not stopped, and that Indian women face the highest rates of victimization and death. The alarming reports of abduction and murder of Native women highlight one of the most devastating issues facing tribal communities. These disappearances and murders are often directly linked to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, sex trafficking, and longstanding harms impacting Indigenous communities. Understanding these connections is essential to addressing the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. For decades, grassroots organizers and families and friends of missing and murdered Indigenous women have been leading the charge to address this crisis. And it's through their efforts in creating this groundswell that this movement is finally getting the attention it deserves. Both the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center and the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center have created a week of action to bring attention to missing and murdered Indigenous women. This week, or earlier this month, Indigenous people all across North America collectively addressed violence against women in their communities through prayer vigils, marches, and demonstrations to seek justice and bring awareness to this issue. Next slide, please. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and American Indian Alaska Native people make up roughly 2.6% of the US population, or a little over 4 million. In terms of victimization, 84.3% of American Indian Alaska Native women have experienced violence. 55.5% have been physically abused by an intimate partner. 40% are trafficking or victims of trafficking. 56.1% have experienced sexual violence, and 48.8% have been stalked in their lifetime. Nationwide, in 2024, there were 5,487 reported cases of missing Indigenous women and girls in the US, of which the vast majority, or 4,089, were under the age of 18. Next slide, please. There are many reasons why these numbers and rates of victimization are so high. And some of the major reasons are we live our lives at the dangerous intersection of sex and race. Many of our communities experience unacceptably high rates of poverty, housing insecurity and homelessness, food insecurity, and access to little or no employment opportunities. We experience complex jurisdictional issues and a jurisdictional maze that so many survivors have to navigate and experience in their quest for justice. Challenges to our identity as Indigenous people, even the definition of who is Indigenous. We often see law enforcement response as inadequate, and sometimes they're not able to respond at all. And 911 is not something that's available in every tribal community. And not all tribal law enforcement units have access to a lot of the, NCC, a lot of the data to determine who's on their reservation and who's a risk and who's not. Stigma and misconception about who we are as Indigenous people continues to prevail. Invisibility, oftentimes our stories are not heard. There's a lack of resources and economic development in many of our communities. There's also a lack of resources for direct services for survivors. In the US, we have fewer than 50 tribal domestic violence shelters. And the availability of housing on tribal nations is just not there. Waiting lists for tribal housing can be as much as those as for other housing vouchers for public housing. Sometimes anywhere from 12 to 16 years is not unheard of. There's a lack of access to adequate health care and behavioral health services, including lack of treatment facilities for substance use and mental health issues. And overall, there's a prolific access to justice in many of our communities. And finally, there's also the objectification, dehumanization of us as a people. For many years, in the early years of this country, we weren't even viewed as human beings. For the domestic and sexual assault survivor, access to safety means access to shelter and housing. Without adequate housing on tribal lands, victims are often forced to leave their ancestral homes and place of significant cultural meaning. Oftentimes, they have to leave their tribal community, which can resemble removal or forced removal or relocation from their tribal community. Oftentimes, they must enter non-tribal shelters or shelters that don't understand and cannot address the cultural relevance of their needs. And oftentimes, they return to their abusers. Despite the high rates of violence in American Indian and Alaska Native communities, again, I say this 1,000 times, there's fewer than 50 tribal domestic violence shelters. And there are many states with large Native populations that don't have access to even one tribal domestic violence shelter. The missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis is rooted in centuries of systemic violence, colonialism, and erasure of Indigenous sovereignty. Too many cases are routinely ignored, mishandled, or never counted. And without a national missing persons database for missing and murdered Indigenous women, we cannot know the true scope of this epidemic. Practically every Indigenous person knows someone who has gone missing, and we are all deeply impacted by this. Last slide, please. It doesn't have to be this way. There is much that is being done, and there's much more that can be done to change this narrative, such as policy changes at the tribal, state and federal levels, increase access to services. We have to create, develop, or implement more services in tribal communities, ensure that all survivors have a safe space or access to a safe space. Implementing harm reduction strategies and approaches that meet survivors where they're at. Access to safe housing is critical and can't be underemphasized. Continued emphasis and engagement in community education and public awareness activities. Building relationships and partnerships with other organizations, including tribal, state, and federal agencies, and the business community. Strengthening our communities, community organizing. Community organizing is so important, especially when a loved one goes missing. You don't need to wait till someone goes missing to begin this. Organizing can be preventative. Implementing programs for girls is another critical element, as evidenced in a lot of the data that Kelly presented. Working with girls beginning at a young age to educate and strengthen skills is so important. Use of culture and traditional practices play a significant role in our communities, including ceremony around this crisis and healing practices. And finally, creating a sense of belonging and acceptance for all our relatives in our respective communities. Native families, advocates, and tribal nations have risen to shine a light on this crisis, to strengthen community action, and to uplift the voices of surviving family members. Today, we call for visibility, support, and positive change to protect Indigenous women and girls and relatives. STARS joins with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center in their commitment to support families, communities, and advocates in bringing greater awareness to this national crisis and in honoring the lives of all those taken too soon. In closing, I just want to thank Manisa and Amani and the Population Council, and Kelly Hallman and Lisa Poland with the Indigenous Justice Circle for the opportunity to be part of this important conversation, and to thank all the participants for the valuable work you do in your communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gwendolyn, and thank you to all of our speakers. I really learned a lot and I really appreciate your expertise. We are going to transition now into our Q&A portion. So just a reminder, if you have questions, you can send them in the Q&A function in the chat. Gwendolyn, I think this first question, if you would like to answer it first, and Kelly and Amanda, feel free to chime in as well. First question I wanted to ask was, what are the biggest misconceptions about violence against Indigenous women and girls that are hindering the kind of progress that you'd like to see?
One of the worst ones that I've heard continuously is that there's a lot of violence in our communities because we're a violent people. I'm just appalled by that statement, because we're, traditionally, that is not our story. The violence was perpetrated against us, not by us. And so I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. And then that seems to normalize and rationalize everything else. And I'm sure Amanda has a lot to add on to that as well.
Well, I think a part of it is just what that awareness. We don't do it in awareness, so that's why we have those barriers. People believe what Gwen was just saying is that the stories that we really need to have a stronger voice and tell our own stories.
Yeah, I think, as Gwen alluded to, the stereotypes that people think it's, Native men perpetrating all of this violence against Native women, when actually a large proportion of the violence is from outside of the community upon us. So people need to be much more aware of that.
Thank you. And Kelly, I was wondering for this next question, if you could answer it first. The current administration, as Manisa kind of talked about in her introduction, has been extremely hostile to federal programs and what they've kind of dubbed either gender ideology or race ideology. Do you plan on doing anything differently in your field going forward over the next couple of years? Any plans to sort of adapt to some of this hostility?
I don't know that we're doing anything differently. One of the things that we do want to be able to strengthen with additional resources and partners is our work with men and boys, because in doing interventions and programs in some other places where we've worked, we find that if we have parallel streams of services for girls and women and services for boys and men, that everyone is better off that way. And so we want to work with everyone in the community and have it be a gender and race specific sort of endeavor, but definitely not leave men and boys out of the equation.
We actually had a question from our audience about kind of what you're talking about, Kelly. They're wondering what the current state of programming for boys and men looks like and what kind of the barriers are to this program. And any of you feel free to chime in on this.
Yeah, so in doing a sort of landscape analysis of programs that are available for Native young people, most of them are not at all gender specific. They talk about Native youth and they don't recognize the very different risks and responsibilities that boys, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQ young people face. So the data that I showed and that both Gwen and Amanda alluded to show that there are very, very big differences by gender within the Native community, and a sort of, generic approach that treats everyone the same is really not going to be very effective. There are programs out there for men and boys, but I don't think they've been scaled to any extent, and certainly there's not that much awareness of them or availability of them within Native communities.
Amanda, I was wondering if this next question, if I could direct it to you first. You spoke about the healing power of ritual and ceremony, and I was wondering, what would you say is the biggest hindrance to these traditions being more widespread in Native communities right now?
I think, being my age and an elder, I have seen so much change in this last 40 years of where our tribal communities have really went back to language and ceremony for healing. And just to look at it in a different view of why did we have to be so secretive about it, and to look at how colonization was a part of that, and that it's okay to talk about how we can heal through ceremonies, and to be able to do it, because what I sense is there's just a lot of that feeling from people where we got to be careful how we share or what we do in public, but those were really, really powerful ceremonies and really powerful methods of harmony that were kept within our tribal communities historically. So to be able to take what we could from them and use them, adjust them to what we have today. And so, it's a movement to have more of that. And I think that's really powerful for, especially for youth, when they see that, when they're going through their identity crisis. And I just wanted to mention something to that previous question you had on the current administration. And that was something that we went through to get our curriculum. We had to have our curriculum and some of our literature relooked at. And adjust them according to the government's mandates now for federal funding. And the way I see it is that, sure, they can do that to our curriculum, but they can't do that to our voice. So that's a way, we could keep on going with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. Another question that was posed from our audience was asking if you all work together with other agencies, community organizations to address this kind of tragedy. We're talking today about Native American women and girls, but it's also present, obviously, in the Black community and LGBTQ plus communities that were mentioned before. And this person is specifically saying that they are thinking of strength in numbers. And so wondering if any of you have anything to say about that.
So we don't have sort of formal collaborations with organizations in other communities in the US, but we do work a lot with organizations in other countries that are addressing these issues. So women in Mayan communities and Aboriginal communities in Australia. So I mean, there's sort of the Indigenous thread that we're following throughout the globe, and the numbers are rising in those places as well. I mean, I certainly follow a number of African American women's organizations, and I'd love to work more with them because obviously they face many and some worse risks than we do.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer, Kelly. We also had another question, and I'm wondering, Gwendolyn, if I could direct this one at you first. Our my boss, wonderful CEO of Population Institute, was saying that she read a feature in the New York Times last week that outlined challenges related to missing and murdered Indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest, and that this was the first time she had seen coverage in that outlet. Are there strategies that we can use to encourage greater attention and stronger, more nuanced, evidence-based media coverage specifically of these challenges?
Yeah, I think a lot of them are being deployed. I mean, I can think back maybe 10 years where you hardly heard about this at all. And now, we have a National Day of Awareness. And I think from the international community, I was working with CWA out of Melbourne in Australia, and they're working on getting the Australian government to create a similar day of awareness. So there's an international movement to bring attention to all of this. But within our media here in the United States, I know on our website we have a guide for the press and media that they can use in how they frame and talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And and when you look at that, you see the examples of how it's really downplayed. And this is really kind of generally speaking across media, is oftentimes it feels like the person is being re-victimized by all of this. I mean, oftentimes a lot of our missing and murdered might be sex workers or things like that. And oftentimes those stories aren't reported, or they're unhoused and they've been living on the streets for a while. That's not reported. It just seems like, it's kind of hard to bring that type of awareness across all the different types of all the different ways that people go missing and murdered. If it's youth, they assume it's a runaway, and it's often not covered then. But it's really hard to get media attention in a lot of states. And I know Amanda works really closely with media in South Dakota, and I probably could respond better to this question than I have. So, Amanda, if you don't mind.
Okay, with our own tribal communities, I think one of the greatest assets that we have had in when we're involved with missing and murdered Indigenous people and the knowledge of it, and we got to find them and getting the word out as social media. That has really become a really very popular communication vehicle in our tribal communities. It doesn't matter how much poverty there is, people manage to find devices, hotspots, ways to get on media. And so much has happened in our tribal communities, even to what happened in North Dakota with the protecting the water. That was all brought together by a social media. And so social media has been a good tool when we're looking at on the tribal level of when somebody goes missing or they're trying to find somebody. And what Gwen said about, the cases of are they really missing or did they just run away? Or sometimes, I've heard officials say that, in our cases, we have looked and they just want to disappear. They don't want to be found by their family. And then so that adds to the numbers. So who is really missing and who is not? And just also, to be able to say, she's been missing, but we need help with it. What kind of resources are there? And if a family can afford a lot of money, then a money dollar amount is put on it. People are more apt to come forward just because of that money. I've seen that happen too. So, but the knowledge of just getting together, the resources on the tribal level, especially when they go missing or even into urban cities around them, how do we do that? And there's just so many jurisdictional levels and different types of ways to communicate that it's not always on the same level. So yeah, there is because of that jurisdictional issue. But I've seen media, like one of the local medias in one of our cities here in South Dakota, the police department would put it out there no matter what. Maybe they're a runaway, but we're going to put it out there in case that, we can be able to do something to help. So in case they could be found, whereas we didn't have that before.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. I think we have time for one last question. So I'll read this one from the chat asking about in terms of jurisdiction and law enforcement barriers, are there practices people have implemented that have been successful in building those relationships in their community? And I would also, add on, where do you see kind of the line in terms of addressing these issues through law enforcement while also not overly persecuting communities from the outside?
I know Gwen has done in training with law enforcement officials. So Gwen, do you want to take a first go at that?
Sure. And I'm sorry if you can repeat the question. We're under a tornado watch right now. So we're having some unstable weather and it was cutting out just a little bit.
Oh, yes, no problem. I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, the question was just on law enforcement and resources to kind of connect communities and also that sort of the line between addressing these issues through law enforcement, but also not overly persecuting communities.
Yeah, I think the main thing in working with law enforcement on this issue is, I mean, I think I think that a really good job has been done in terms of getting that old thing done away with, where you go to report and right away they say, oh, you have to wait 48 hours. And people say, oh, they don't do that anymore, but we still hear about law enforcement agencies telling people they have to wait 48 hours. And we know that first 48 hours is critical. So there has been a lot of training done with law enforcement, especially in some areas of the country, like I think the Pacific Northwest. They've done a really good job in taking the lead on that. For a lot of law enforcement agencies, even their domestic violence training is very, could just be a couple hours is all they're required to train. And so there needs to be a whole lot more training for law enforcement. And I think a lot of the, like the Gabby Petito case and a number of other ones really brought that out, that, you know, they're how not asking the right question or making assumptions, and, you know, not really having the proper training is really important. It's always important to work with law enforcement, and especially and when someone goes missing, uh, and they take the case right away, because so much information can be found in those first few hours. There's so much that's out there. There's cameras and things like that. And nowadays, there's so much technology out there that I think really helps a lot in those cases. Again, a lot of tribal law enforcement don't have access to that technology, but you know, there is funding for a lot of, and I don't think any of that funding's been cut. I think it's been increased actually, to help law enforcement, you know, get the proper tools and equipment to do what they need to do in their communities.
That's a really great answer. Thank you so much, Gwendolyn. And so that takes us almost to the end. I'm going to pass things over to Kelly Hallman again, just so that she can tell us a little bit more about the Indigenous Justice Circle and next steps that people can take today to help with this issue.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the great questions. And those that we didn't get to, we'll try to follow up by email later. Next slide, please. So our organization, Indigenous Justice Circle, we're a Native American female-controlled nonprofit. We convene, connect, and strengthen Indigenous leaders and organizations. Our three main areas that we work on are health equity, gender justice, and missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit. In our work, we want to strengthen social connections, cultural identity, legal access, financial inclusion, have all these backed by tribal sovereignty that's respected by the federal government and other forms of government, state, county. And we want to use all these to bolster our bodily autonomy, to keep us safer and healthier, and allow us to exercise our legal, economic, and political rights that allow us to maintain these freedoms. Next slide, please. This is one of the things we've been working on a lot in Indian country the last 5 or so years, are intergenerational girl societies. And these are physical meetings that take place on a weekly or every 2 weeks or monthly basis in the community, where women and girls get together and strengthen one another. This can be cultural teachings, this can be health education, health access. It can be things like financial education, a whole range of things. We have a curriculum that I'll show you the cover of in a minute, but basically we help communities, both urban Indian communities and tribal communities, start and keep these groups going. And we are hoping that in time they can serve as an early warning system if a woman or girl goes missing. And so we basically want to support safe and brave spaces for Native women and girls in all communities where they find themselves. Next slide, please. Some of the goals are, as I mentioned, safe spaces, connections, skills, and also where ceremonies, like Amanda mentioned, are reemerging in tribal communities, to share those with girls and have them be part of traditional ceremonies that were outlawed before 1973. Next slide, please. We want to learn with tribal communities. We have an advisory council of Native women. We offer awards to Native-controlled organizations, funding awards. We have virtual monthly intertribal gatherings where all the women doing this work get together on Zoom. We've done that for the last 5 years. And we also provide direct mentoring to young people who are away from their home communities, often in urban areas, trying to find work, go to college for the first time, and maybe isolated and want a Native sort of mentor or group to be part of. Next slide, please. These are some of the organizations that we've worked with so far, and most of them are in areas that are heavily Native American, which are the purple shaded areas, more Native people than otherwise. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we have an implementation guide. How do you do this from step A, B, C, D, all the way to Z? So we've done this work in a lot of other communities, Indigenous communities around the world, and we sort of have a recipe that you can follow that we found works. Next slide, please. We also have a curriculum guide. We have 36 sessions in this curriculum. It's a scripted one, so you can just read it out the first few times if you don't have experience facilitating groups. We also have this resilience challenge game that is basically 150 skills or things that Native girls, women, and probably boys and men should know. And it's a real sort of discussion piece in terms of starting your program or honing your program if you already have one. Next slide, please. So we do have another request for applications open for new partners who want to do this intergenerational Girls Society work. It is on our website. It's indigenousjc for justicircle.org. The application is not long. It's open for 2 months from May 15th to July 14th, so check it out. These are our social media handles if you're interested in following us, and I thank everyone for joining today and the wonderful speakers who shared such great information.
Thank you, Kelly, so much for informing us a little bit about what Indigenous Justice Circle is doing. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Kelly, Amanda, and Gwen, for all your stories and expertise that you've shared with us. We heard a little bit from Kelly on the historical and sociological context for why this issue is so prevalent and lacking the attention it needs. We learned a little bit from Amanda about the need to reclaim the sacred status of Native American women and different advocacy measures like equitable funding, safe spaces, Native-led research, and grassroots level advocacy. And we heard from Gwen on a little bit more of the issue at hand and how Red Dress Day has been part of raising awareness and how we need to continue to honor those who we have lost. So I hope what you're taking away from this webinar today, that femicide is very much present in the United States, and specifically the issues surrounding missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I want to thank Amani for leading the webinar today and the Indigenous Justice Circle for co-sponsoring. The recording will be available on the Population Institute YouTube later this week. And tomorrow you'll get an email with some of the links of the reports that we've mentioned throughout. And with that, I'll let you all have the rest of your day.